You've seen this image 100 times. A small boy on a stone altar, arms bound, his father's knife raised, an angel stopping it at the last second. But Jewish tradition going back nearly 2,000 years calculates that Isaac was not a child. He was 37 years old. And Genesis says he carried the wood for his own burnt offering, a sacrifice burned completely on an altar, up the mountain himself. That's not something a small child does. That's a load for a grown man on a steep climb. Think about that for a second. Every painting you've ever seen of this scene, the small boy, the tied wrists, the terror on a child's face, is not coming from the Bible. It's coming from somewhere else entirely. It's not that Sunday school made the story up. The rescue, the ram, the angel are all there in the text. It's the boy that got invented. If you grew up hearing this was a story about a father willing to give up everything, that part is still true. But there's a second person in this story, and the simplified version turned him into a prop. If you were taught that Isaac was 7 or 8 years old, that number doesn't come from any verse in the Bible. It comes from a painting. The oldest sources we have tell a completely different story. So where does the number 37 come from? And can you actually trust a calculation that old? If Isaac was a grown man, what did he know, and when did he know it? And if the text has always described an adult who walked up that mountain willingly, who turned him into a frightened boy? Here's something strange about Genesis. It's one of the only books in the ancient world that tracks a woman's age at death down to the exact year, and then places that death right after one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire Bible, with no transition. The very next chapter after the binding opens with Sarah dying at 127. No other story comes between the binding and Sarah's death. No travel, no time skip. The text moves straight from the mountain to the funeral. And the math is simple. Genesis chapter 17, verse 17 says Sarah was 90 years old when Isaac was born. Genesis chapter 23, verse 1 says she died at 127. 127 minus 90 is 37. That's Isaac's age at the binding, according to the earliest Jewish commentary on Genesis, compiled roughly 1,500 years ago. The ancient sources read the placement of Sarah's death as deliberate. She heard what happened on the mountain, and the shock killed her. Whether or not you take that reading literally, the math is right there in the text, and they noticed it. Now, not every ancient source agrees on 37. A Jewish historian named Josephus, writing in the 1st century, about 60 years after Jesus, placed Isaac at 25. That's younger than the traditional number, but it's still a grown man, not a boy. If you grew up picturing a small child on that mountain, no ancient source agrees with you. Not one. The earliest readers of this text, the ones closest to the original language and the original culture, understood Isaac as an adult. And that changes everything. Because the story stops being about a child who couldn't resist. It starts being about a man who chose not to. So if Isaac was a grown man, an adult who could have overpowered his elderly father at any point, then what did he know? And what does the text actually show him doing? If someone hands you a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a bag of cement, and tells you they're taking you to dig a well, you don't need them to say what's about to happen. You already know. Isaac knew. Genesis chapter 22, verse 6 says, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac. Isaac carried it. Abraham carried the fire and the knife, and they walked up together. Then Isaac speaks. It's the only thing he says on the entire mountain. He says, here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Stop and picture that. Isaac has inventoried the elements of a sacrifice. He names the fire. He names the wood. He can see the knife in his father's hand. The only thing missing is the animal. And he says so. That is not a naive child's question. That is a man who knows exactly what a burnt offering requires, and has noticed the one thing that's missing. If you grew up hearing that Isaac was too young to understand what was happening, read Genesis chapter 22, verse 7 again. He listed the inventory himself. Abraham answers, God will provide for himself the lamb, my son. And then the text does something it almost never does. It repeats itself. They went both of them together. That exact phrase already appeared 2 verses earlier, in verse 6. Now it appears again in verse 8. After the question, after the answer. Think about what that means. Isaac heard the answer. He understood it. And he kept walking. Together. They arrive at the top. Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, binds Isaac, lays him on it, and the text records nothing. No crying, no struggling, no running, no protest, not a single word of resistance. The silence is enormous, and the earliest Jewish commentary fills it with something most Christians have never heard. It says Isaac asked Abraham to bind him tightly so he wouldn't flinch and ruin the offering. This is what gets lost when you shrink Isaac down to a child. A child can't ask that question. A child can't carry that wood. And a child can't choose to keep walking after hearing the answer. If you're starting to see a completely different story than the one you grew up with, subscribe. We do this every week. One story, the parts that got left out. So here's where we are. Every ancient source puts Isaac between 25 and 37. He carried the wood, asked the one question that proves he knew, and the text says they walked forward together. The version you grew up with had a frightened child. The version the text describes had a man who kept walking. So the question is, who put the boy in the painting? Think about what happens when you crop a photograph. You take a wide shot, the whole room, the people, the furniture, and someone crops it tight to just one person's face. The expression looks completely different without the context. You can make someone look angry, afraid, confused, depending on where you draw the frame. That is what happened to this story. The wide shot was always there. A grown man carrying firewood up a mountain alongside his elderly father. Both of them walking in step, both of them knowing. But somewhere along the way, the frame got cropped down to one image, a small boy tied to an altar, crying. Once you've only ever seen the cropped version, you forget there was ever a wider frame. The cropping started in the 2nd century. Early Christian writers and artists built an elaborate comparison between Isaac and Jesus. Isaac was the beloved son offered by his father. Jesus was the beloved son offered by his father. Isaac carried the wood up the mountain. Jesus carried the cross. The comparison is powerful, but it created a problem. To make the comparison work, Isaac needed to be young, innocent, and passive. A child victim, not a grown man choosing his own death. Scholar Edward Kessler studied how Jewish and Christian traditions interpreted this story differently. He documented how centuries of Christian art gradually made Isaac younger and younger. The adult in the Jewish tradition became the small boy in the Western imagination. No one sat down and decided to lie about Isaac's age. The comparison with Jesus was powerful, and a child on an altar makes it hit harder. The simplified version won because it was useful, not because someone was hiding anything. But here's what was lost. In Jewish tradition, Isaac was never a victim. He was a hero, a man who walked up a mountain knowing what was ahead and chose to go anyway. Not because he was too young to resist, but because he was old enough to choose. Next time you see a painting of the binding of Isaac in any church, in any children's Bible, look at how old Isaac is. That's not the Bible talking, that's the crop. And if the original story was always about an adult who chose to walk up the mountain, then what was the story really about? Go back to that mountain. Not the one in the painting, the one in the text. A man in his 30s carries a heavy load of firewood up a steep trail. His father, well over 100 years old, walks beside him with a knife and a small clay pot of fire. The son asks one question. The father gives one answer, and they keep walking, together. At the top, the son lies down on the wood he carried himself. No one forces him. The text doesn't record a single word of protest. Not one. If you grew up hearing this was a story about a boy who almost died, it's not. It's a story about a man who was willing to. After the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 CE, Jewish communities facing persecution and death returned to this story again and again. They didn't call it the sacrifice. They called it the binding. Because the point wasn't what almost happened to Isaac. The point was what Isaac chose. He chose to be bound. He chose to stay. The version most people grew up with, a terrified child rescued at the last second, is a powerful image, but it's a smaller story than the one the text actually tells. The text tells the story of two people walking up a mountain together, both knowing what was ahead and choosing to keep walking. The next time you see a painting of the binding of Isaac, the small boy, the altar, the knife, you'll know. It's a powerful image. It's just not the one the text describes. The text describes two men walking up a mountain together, both of them knowing, both of them willing. If you want to keep seeing what the text actually says, subscribe.